The panel is enforcing norms in cyber diplomacy and law enforcement. And we have a great collection of folks here, 4 of whom are diplomats, one of whom is a law enforcement guy who I've actually known the longest, Adam Hickey. I think I was chosen to moderate this panel because I ended my government career as a diplomat, but I started my government career as a prosecutor. So I have a foot in both camps. And when I made the transition to becoming a diplomat, it wasn't really the easiest transition. There are definite things that are different between being a diplomat and being a prosecutor. One is that when you get into diplomacy, they use terms like interventions. I was chairing my first foot in diplomacy was I was chairing the G8 high-tech crime group in 2000, right after the 9/11 attacks in 2001. And when people say intervention in the law enforcement area, it either means an intervention in court or someone actually needs help because of a drug and alcohol problem. That may still be true, but when they asked me, when I was the chair of the group and people raised their name cards and said, "Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make an intervention," I was worried I did something wrong. So that was one, just the linguistics. The second one is diplomacy moves relatively slowly, where prosecution moves pretty quickly. There are different aspects at play. And I remember after that first meeting, and again, this is the first meeting after 9/11, this G8 group had worked for years to do really groundbreaking work in terms of law enforcement, international cybercrime issues, cooperative networks, et cetera. But it moved pretty slowly. It was very hard to get all those 8 countries, which then include Russia, to agree on things. But after 9/11, the first meeting that I ended up chairing, we agreed on lots of things. We made lots of progress. Unfortunately, that led one of the representatives, I won't say which country, came up to me afterwards, and they said, you did a good job of chairing, but you got too much done. We moved too quickly. And then he turned to me and said, but you'll learn. So I think in this arena, in the cyber arena, this is sort of an exception. We have made a lot of progress in a relatively short time, not without challenges, not without hurdles, particularly with respect to norms and a stability framework in cyberspace. And in diplomatic terms, really between 2013 and 2015 and then after, there's been a lot of movement here. And I think it also reflects more and more countries understanding this as a core concern. So first, let me introduce the panels, and I'll have a couple remarks, and then we'll get into the panelists, and they'll give a short intervention or statement for DOJ, and then we'll get into some questions and answers. As I said, this is a great group. Let me start with right here, Toby Feakin. He's the Australian Ambassador for Cyber Affairs. He's been doing that job about 2 years now. Australia's first inaugural cyber ambassador, so that was great. Adam Hickey, who is the prosecutor, the DOJ person to your right, he's a DAG, not to be confused with the DAG, who was the second in command, but the Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the National Security Division, who's been doing a lot on these cybercrime cases. Timo Koster over next is from the Netherlands. He's the ambassador at large and in charge of, among other things, cyber. He comes from NATO before that. Manoah LeBlanc she is part of the European Union work in this area. She's in what's called the External Action Service, which is the European Union's foreign policy branch. And she's been there for a few years now, really molding the European Union's cybersecurity, cyber policy, cyber diplomacy issues, and she's been really instrumental in that. And last but not least, Rob Strayer, who is the ambassador at the State Department in the Economic Bureau, ambassador of cyber and digital affairs, covering a wide range of topics, doing many of the things I used to do when I was there, and doing them very well, I might add. So a really good panel, a really strong panel on this very important discussion. You heard David Coe talk about the importance of a rule-based system in everything, really, but also in cyber and more particularly. And a lot of the work that's been done over the last several years has been really trying to enforce and carry forward that rules-based system and really apply a rules-based system to cyberspace. And that involved, among other things, saying that international law applies in cyberspace just like it does in the physical world. How it actually applies, we're still working out. There's some contentious issues around that. But that wasn't always agreed to. At one point, several countries, China and Russia among them, said it doesn't apply, and this is a free fire zone. There are no rules that apply. This is the wild, wild west. It's not. We got an agreement in 2013 at this group of government experts in the UN that international law does apply. The second part of it is there are lots of things below the thresholds of armed conflict. Despite all you read in the papers about cyber warfare and where it's cyber war, the fact is most of what we see doesn't come close to what would normally be thought of as an armed conflict. So given that, what are the rules of the road for that kind of activity? And a lot of the work that's been done, both in settings like the UN, but also bilaterally and multilaterally among many of the people here, is to come up with what those rules of the road, those voluntary norms are. And there have been a number of significant ones, including don't attack the critical infrastructure of another country absent wartime. In peacetime, don't do that. In wartime, there are different rules, but don't do it in peacetime. Don't attack the computer emergency response teams, like the ambulance or the hospitals. Again, a lot of agreement on that, including China and Russia agreeing on the set of 11 norms that you heard both David Coe talk about and other speakers talk about and Catherine talk about, which I think was important. And David said how this has now been accepted by the ASEAN ministers, which is really important. So work in that area. And then finally, the idea of confidence building measures, transparency measures, hotlines, things like that. All that work has been done by many of the people around this table. And it's been important work, and I think a lot of progress has been made. But with that, having rules of the road, or even having international law apply, is great. But if they're just words on paper and there are no consequences, if there's no enforcement, if there's no accountability, they lose a lot of their value. And indeed, you create the opposite dynamic. If there are no consequences for people who break the rules, then that itself becomes a norm of inaction. And that's one of the issues that I think everyone's been struggling with. Now, over the last year and a half, it's really been a banner year in terms of this issue because we've seen lots and lots and lots of malicious state activity in cyberspace, including the interference, the Russian interference and disruption of our own election, which obviously brought the matter home to us, but also the big NotPetya worm that Melissa talked about a little bit in the last panel that caused widespread damage and was attributed to Russia, and the NotPetya worm that was attributed to North Korea, and then the OPCW event, which happened in the Netherlands, which again was Russia. So we've seen a lot of that activity, and it seems like matters are getting in some ways worse. So you have these bad activities happening, and they seem to be happening apace. So the question is, how do you hold people accountable? How do you enforce those norms? And that's what we really want to discuss today, both how you build these rules of the road, but also how you enforce them through a number of different means, including law enforcement means that we'll talk about. So what I'd like to do is to ask each of our panelists two things. One, if you want to supplement the very short bio I gave for you and say something that you want people to know about yourself, please do. Their full bios are in the packet that you all received. But second, give just a very short introduction to your perspectives on these issues. I think no more than 5 minutes, because we want to make this interactive both between you guys and the audience. And we'll just go down the chain, and we'll start with Toby.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's always very fortunate. I seem to always sit at the beginning of these panels, and it's always the best place to be. And poor Rob's down the end, and I'll have to pick up the scraps at the end. What I thought I'd do is, rather than kind of go through similar ground, what I thought I'd do is reflect on 2 years in this job and what I've seen shift over that time. And I think I'll probably paint a more positive picture, actually, Chris, than perhaps you did in your introductory comments. Because what I've seen over these 2 years, firstly, is a fundamental shift in the way that we as nations, or certain nations, Australia included within that, approach this issue. We're more transparent and open about everything that we do in cyberspace, everything that we stand for in cyberspace, than at any other point in history. Whether it be talking about our offensive capability, be it about our approach to international law, norms, including our vulnerabilities as well. And also in terms of our responses, we're becoming more and more open in that sense as well. The second point I thought I'd make is that includes exposing malicious behavior in cyberspace. When I started in this job, that was just not happening at the pace and scale that we now are exposing malicious behavior. And we now talk about particular states. When I began this job 2 years ago, I couldn't talk specifically about the activities of Iran, China, North Korea, and Russia. And that's a better place to be, because then when you combine that with the third thing that I thought I would say, More nations now understand, I think, than 2 years ago, what international law looks like in this area, and also understand a bit more about what norms mean and how they can be applied. And that means that the basis for taking actions are more clearly understood than before, I think, and it also assists us in terms of exposing some of the hypocrisy of some nations in the international environment in the positions that they take. And that's useful in multilateralism, which, as you rightly say, sometimes moves a little bit too slowly for its own good. So we could do with a little bit more of the fast forward button, I think, and hopefully we can get that through this year. I think the fourth point I would say is that we're increasingly dispelling the myth that attribution is impossible. That was the thing that was always commonly said, right? And a lot of countries still maintain that attribution is impossible. It's not, and we're getting much better at doing attribution. I think we're getting better at explaining how attribution is done, and the fact that we can now even pinpoint particular groups, and through the fine work of Adam and his team, individuals who are conducting these operations, means that we're showing that attribution isn't impossible. It's actually becoming a far more accurate process. I think the fifth point I would say is that our muscle memory is getting much, much better in terms of attribution and all the things that might subsequently come after that. It's true to say we're learning by doing. There's a bit of transparency for you, but through doing that, we're getting much, much better at information sharing and at acting more quickly in the international environment. All of that said, there's tons more work to do. We need to become faster, more effective at these things, better at explaining our case to the public, giving more information to the public. And I think, in that way, we can uplift the level of education, the level of understanding, and the level of engagement in this issue by not only senior policymakers, but also the public at large. And I'll complete there. Thank you.
Adam?
Thanks, Chris. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for having me here today. I definitely feel like the odd man out on this panel, but I will try to conduct myself in the finest traditions of diplomacy while I'm up here. Let me tell you a little bit about my role, just for context. As Chris said, I work in the National Security Division at the Justice Department. I'm responsible, broadly speaking, for our enforcement and policy efforts that relate to foreign state-sponsored threats to the private sector. And what I mean by that is counterintelligence cases or cases involving foreign states that are beyond the conventional model of espionage or state versus state activity. And so that includes our investigations of computer intrusions and attacks, but also economic espionage cases, our enforcement efforts concerning export controls and sanctions, our malign foreign influence work, so FARA enforcement, election interference, and our foreign investment reviews, so the CFIUS process. And the point of creating that position at the Justice Department was to recognize that foreign states use cyber as one tool among many, and that in defending our national assets, we should create a structure that takes a big picture view of what foreign states want, what their objectives are, and the means by which they're attaining it, both illicit and illicit. So let me give you an overview of how cyber in the national security space has evolved at the Justice Department. If you went back to 2012 and before, we viewed state-sponsored hacking as essentially an intelligence collection problem. You wanted to know who your adversaries were. You wanted to know within the government what they were doing. And to some extent, perhaps a limited extent, you would try to warn the private sector. But you viewed it largely as an intel collection challenge. And approaching it that way meant you wouldn't want to do anything visible or overt because you might jeopardize your sources and methods to collect that intelligence. And so for a long time, we treated cyber principally as a problem of information, collecting the most information and not doing anything to disrupt our collection. But beginning in 2012, the entire federal government pivoted and applied some of the lessons we learned in the counterterrorism space to cyber, which is to say we started talking about a whole of government approach, one where all of our various diplomatic, military, economic, and law enforcement tools would be directed against the problem, and we would try to change behavior through deterrence, incapacitation, disruption, and otherwise. And so at the Justice Department, we stood up a nationwide program that involved training prosecutors in every district on how to bring national security cyber cases specifically. Chris and others know that on the criminal side, we had been investigating hackers and thieves for a long time, but we hadn't used the same approach towards state-sponsored actors. We started doing that. And in 2014, we brought the first public case involving state-sponsored activity, charges against 5 officers of the Chinese military. Since then, I think we've had a number of accomplishments. In 2018, we charged more cases than we did in the 5 prior years combined. We have, contrary to conventional wisdom, arrested a number of our targets, including an aerospace engineer who was working for the Chinese Air Force, a Canadian hacker for hire who was helping the Russian FSB spy on dissidents and others, a German who was helping the Syrian Electronic Army extort their hacking victims, a Kosovar terrorist who hacked into retailers and posted a so-called kill list, and an MSS officer who was recruiting employees at American companies to steal trade secrets. And even where we didn't arrest defendants, I think we had successes. I think our charging instruments have been statements of norms, have reinforced the US government's position on what behavior is acceptable and not acceptable by nation states, and have proven to be, in recent years, a rallying point for like-minded nations. We have moved in a direction the criminal division has been for years. We have started to use our investigations to try to disrupt the activity by either taking down botnets or at least collecting information about who's infected so that ISPs and others can help them remediate. And we've taken our cases and the records that we've built to economic agencies like Treasury and Commerce and USTR, and they have used them as the basis for their own tools to impose consequences that we, the Justice Department, might not be able to. So I think there are a couple conclusions from our experience. One is that indictments are not the end game alone, but attribution is the cornerstone of every other consequence. You need to know who is responsible, and you need to have a way of proving that, whether privately or publicly, in order to impose other consequences. And law enforcement investigations, I submit, are useful, will continue to be useful, because they are uniquely qualified to lead to the result you want for attribution, which is something that is credible, specific, and unclassified, or can be used in a public forum. So I'll stop there.
Timo.
Thanks a lot. First of all, thank you to Catherine and to the Atlantic Council for having me here. It's a great opportunity and a great audience. Let me steal one term that Adam just used, influencing behavior of state actors, and start with 2 premises, because I believe that both last night and today the word deterrence is being used quite liberally. So my 2 premises are, first of all, good state behavior does not occur by itself. Unfortunately, not all states will do the right thing without being encouraged. And secondly, deterring malicious behavior so far doesn't work. So we need more tools to influence behavior and get somewhere where we can actually confidently use the term deterrence. So for the Netherlands, after the high-profile cases in 2017 and 2018 that were already mentioned, we could see a momentum building towards expanding the response options, expanding the tools to influence behavior, not just in the Netherlands itself, but also in the European Union and with several of our allies across the globe. So the conclusion was that just developing norms and building up our resilience, soft measures like the NRS directive, were not enough to successfully influence state and non-state behavior. Even outreach and capacity building, which is a very important tool, was not enough. We were clearly of the opinion that we needed more tools, and we also would need to be able to apply those tools coherently. So we set out to develop a diplomatic response framework in the Netherlands. Almost at the same time, we initiated, when we had the EU presidency, in the EU to work on a diplomatic toolbox. And that at least gave both us nationally and the EU as a collective some framework to both overtly and covertly react to infractions and malicious behavior by way of attribution, by way of naming and shaming. And that was certainly a step forward. But still, we recognize that just that will not deter actors, or at least not deter all actors from the kind of behavior that we would like them to refrain from. So the collective is very important, and we're still developing those kind of collective tools. I'm sure Rob will later on speak about the cyber deterrence initiative that the US is developing, which is again a complement to what we're seeking. Again, using the word deterrence in that title is, at least to me, probably a bit premature, but let's see where we get. But it's clear that building out that continuum of response options included not just the soft outreach and developing norms, not just diplomatic response, but also needed a coherent approach with law enforcement, which Adam just talked about, developing a sanctions regime, which the EU is now doing, which is not easy because it entails agreement between 28 nations on sanctions, on the nature of the sanctions, on the target of the sanctions, and that's politically not easy. We need, if you go further into that continuum, we need to strengthen, in the Netherlands at least, both the capabilities of our defense and our intel community to be able to go on the offensive if we need to counter-hack and to basically not just wait to be attacked and then defend. And we're not the only nation that has declared offensive capabilities, so I think that's a very important part of that response continuum. And finally, but that's not where we are at this moment, we may come to the point where actually cyber will lead to a military response. I worked at NATO for a number of years, and we have recognized that a cyber attack can constitute an Article 5 invocation, where a military response, when a cyber attack does large damage, part of a hybrid campaign could actually trigger a military response. So I think that's important to sketch that what we try to do is build out that spectrum from resilience all the way on the left to a military response all the way on the right, and everything in between. So what do we need to do if we want to build that response continuum successfully? First of all, we need to continue to develop all those tools at the same time, so not concentrate on the hard part only, but resilience is still important, and of course you're all aware of the very difficult and political discussion about 5G and who to allow on our networks. That's very much a resilience question in my mind. Capacity building is very important to continue to invest in that. As David Coe mentioned this morning, we're going into a couple of UN tracks, a GGE and an OEWG. There we need to invest in capacity building to get especially the swing states on our side. And we need to be able to coordinate all those tools at our disposal and realize that we should be able to calibrate those tools, because at the moment I feel, and we discussed this on a previous occasion, Adam, it's not good enough if we see an attack and we just throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. We have to try to calibrate the tools that we have. And finally, certainly for the Netherlands, that means that we have to get better at the whole of government approach and coordination between the different parts of our government and the different international organizations, because when I worked at NATO, there's still a world to win in terms of cooperation between NATO and the European Union, for example. So let me stop there, and happy to take
Thanks, and I should just note there were a lot of stories recently about under the Japan Defense Agreement that cyber could trigger that agreement because that could be an act of war, act of armed conflict. Indeed, NATO agreed to that several years ago, and Australia and the U.S.-Australia Joint Defense Agreement also agreed to that about 4 years ago, I think. So it's not particularly, that's not particularly revelatory. I guess the question is, and this is something we'll address later on, when you really cross that threshold, because it's basically when when you see it, then it will be called out. But it's not clear what that threshold is. Manon?
Yes, indeed. For those who don't know the European External Action Service, it's the EU diplomatic service. So I work at EU level, and together with member states, we shape EU cyber diplomacy efforts. Part of these efforts is the framework for a joint EU diplomatic response to malicious cyber activities, also known as the Cyber Diplomacy Toolbox. And this was an idea that was put forward indeed by the Dutch presidency in 2016 and led to a political framework and implementing guidelines in 2017. The framework allows the EU to use all of its measures within the common foreign and security policy to respond to malicious cyber activities that are contrary to the responsible behavior that we agreed upon, for instance, in the UN. The measures include preventive but also restrictive measures, and this is indeed an example of the continuum that Timo talked about, because it's part of this continuum, but not the full, does not cover the full spectrum of EU cyber diplomacy, because it's part of this wider effort to increase security and stability in cyberspace. It really supports the efforts to encourage cooperation, to mitigate cybersecurity threats, and to influence behavior of potential aggressors. And I fully agree with what Timo says. It's an approach that includes multiple measures and is using the full spectrum, including those that relate to resilience, including those that lead to cooperation, such as the confidence building measures that are in place in some regional organizations. To talk a bit about what the toolbox gave us. So the toolbox did not only give us the measures to respond to malicious cyber activities below the threshold, it also gave us the opportunity to exchange on threats and to share situational awareness on these threats within the EU. It's a mechanism to make decisions on responses, joint EU responses to malicious cyber activities, such as we, for instance, did when we released a public denouncement of the OPCW, or Council conclusions in response to the NotPetya and WannaCry attacks, or most recently, the declaration by the High Representative of the EU on behalf of EU member states condemning malicious cyber activities, in particular the increase of intellectual property theft. It's also a platform where we can decide on attribution, where we can coordinate attribution. Attribution is a national sovereign decision, a political decision by EU member states, but the EU Cyber Diplomacy Toolbox offers this platform where member states can coordinate these decisions. It's also a mechanism to coordinate, for instance, with our like-minded, such as US, obviously, but also the cooperation with NATO to see, okay, where does it go from the diplomatic response at the EU level up to NATO, and how can we better align those efforts together. I think this is one of the examples of how cooperation with regard to a diplomatic response to malicious cyber activities could work, and how all measures that you have within your foreign policy can be used in order to deter malicious cyber activities. And then I'm talking about deterrence in the broad spectrum, so not only deterrence by cost imposition. Indeed, we are developing currently, we're at the final stages of negotiating restrictive measures, so the cyber sanctions regime, but deterrence goes beyond cost imposition and goes beyond attribution. Deterrence is also deterrence by denial or by entanglement, where we together make sure that normative behavior, responsible behavior is the norm and not cyber attacks is the norm. But we need to find, to my opinion, the balance between, on one hand, making sure that cyber attacks are not the norm, on the other hand, making sure that cyber diplomacy is not reduced to cost imposition. So we need to be smart and we need to be responsible, and in that case, we need to use all the measures that are offered and that we have within our toolbox, within our foreign policy, to make sure that cyberspace remains stable and secure.
Rob?
Thank you. I want to thank the Atlantic Council and Catherine for organizing this conference again this year. Chris, I want to thank you for your excellent intro and sort of lead into all of our statements. It's a privilege to be with so many of my international colleagues on this panel, and to be with Adam as well, and to see so many folks that from the international community that I've worked with around the world. I just want to step back. I feel like it's always important to do this, to truly recognize the value that we get from the internet. The internet that we've developed over the last roughly 3 decades since we first had a World Wide Web has produced so much economic growth and value and shared prosperity around the world. But of course, that's being undermined by increasingly sophisticated and frequent attacks that are often more increasingly sponsored by nation states. The threat is truly transnational, as any activity in one part of the world can immediately touch a different part of the world. Because of the nature of the challenge, that no one country has all the solutions, we know that we need to work together. We need strong international cooperation. We need that so we can improve our defenses. We also need it so we can reach cyber criminals, so that there's no safe haven for them around the world, and that we can have an approach to nation states that asks them to comply with norms of responsible state behavior. For many years, the United States has worked with other countries to establish a framework of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. There's 3 elements to that. The first is recognizing that international law applies in cyberspace just as it does in the real world. And that includes the principle of non-intervention, that one country should not interfere in the domestic affairs of another state through cyberspace. The second element is that there are norms of responsible state behavior. There are 12 norms that we have recognized with a number of our countries, including Russia and China. And the third element is confidence-building measures. Those are measures that increase the transparency about our national cyber strategies, about our national policies in cyberspace, and that includes military cyber activities. It's important that we have this transparency so we can build trust among countries, we can avoid escalation, and that we can avoid risk of unintended consequences in cyberspace. Last September, the United States recognized formally that just having norms of responsible state behavior is not enough. They're not self-enforcing. We need to move from just recognizing those 12 norms to holding nations accountable for their malicious activity. In particular, we noted that we will start to bring consequences that are swift, transparent, and costly against malicious state actors. Those are seeking to deter nations from undertaking destabilizing, disruptive, and destructive activities in cyberspace. There are 4 main elements to the efforts that we're now undertaking to now implement a cyber deterrence strategy. The first is that we're seeking to identify those types of activities that we will deter. It's not all cyber activities. It's ones that we consider to be destabilizing, destructive, and that are in violation of the norms of responsible state behavior. The second effort that we're undertaking is building a much broader set of consequences that we can bring to bear against adversaries in cyberspace. And we've often talked about using all elements of national power, but as we've been talking about on the panel today, there's a full range from diplomatic to law enforcement to economic to even military, both kinetic and cyber consequences that could be brought to bear to convince nations that the asymmetric value that they've gotten out of their malicious cyber activity is not worth the cost of undertaking it in the future. The third element of our deterrence strategy is the messaging that has to go along with that. We're going to message to nation states that if they undertake these activities that are malicious and that violate the norms of responsible state behavior, that we will bring consequences against them. It's important that we message in this way because we don't want to be just reactive. We want to be proactive. We want to establish in advance that they undertake certain activities. There will be timely and costly consequences that come afterward. And the fourth and probably the most critical element of this is that we work with a coalition of other nations to bring consequences. As you can tell from the discussion today, we're not talking just about doing joint attributions, which has been tremendous progress over the years. We've now, as I think Toby outlined at the beginning, we've had a number of different cyber attacks that we've responded to with joint attributions. The OPCW had more than 20 governments joining together to attribute that activity to Russia. So as we build this coalition of like-minded countries, we're going to do so in a way that's transparent and that will allow us not just to do attribution, to actually impose consequences together. We think it's important for two reasons. First is that as we do consequences together, the impact is magnified by the ability for multiple countries to have the same consequence brought against a particular adversary. For example, sanctions are much stronger when done with a large coalition of other governments. But it's also important that we do it together to establish the legitimacy of those, of the norms and the activities that we seek to call out as in violation of those norms. So we will have the moral high ground as we talk about activities that should not be undertaken in cyberspace. Initially, we are talking with a rather limited number of like-minded governments, but we're inviting all countries around the world to join us in affirming these norms of responsible state behavior. We all know that we share common values about human rights and fundamental freedoms that can be expressed online, and that there should be free expression online, the ability to exercise religion online, the ability to organize and to have freedom of assembly. If we don't stand together to continue to defend our vision and our values online, then we will seek to have that continue, then it will continue to be undermined by malicious state activities. Thank you.
Well, thank you to you all. I have some specific questions for each of you, but I thought I'd start with a general question. And many of you talked about attribution, and clearly attribution means something different in the DOJ context than it does in the political context. Attribution is often thought of as a political, when it's done by countries against another country, a political decision. Russia has often argued that you need super attribution. You need almost 100% proof. You need to be transparent and release all your evidence. Should there be a standard for attribution? And the second part of that question, I think, is actually maybe the harder one, which is, we've talked about some of these joint public attributions that have been done. It is true that many countries joined the OPCW one, and I think part of that was the evidence was just so overwhelming there. But many countries didn't join the NotPetya one. They didn't join the WannaCry one, even big countries that are close partners and allies. And there's lots of reasons for that, but I think one of the things is that countries have to satisfy themselves that the actor they're accusing did it. And I think that gets even harder when you're going to try to impose consequences. So I guess the question I have for you is what is the right level generally, if there's a right level? And then two, how can you share that information with other countries who are sometimes not the Five Eyes or the Netherlands or other countries that work together more routinely, but countries you don't normally work with, to get them on board in this joint effort to not only call countries out, but also do something more, impose costs? And I'll throw that open to anyone and everyone. Or I'll start calling on people.
I'm next to you, Chris. You can push me first. I think the first point is to say that do we have a common standard of attribution in any other area of international security work? No. So should it be that cyber is treated in some way completely differently to any other form of attribution? No. So, that the Russians had made that call, we'd disagree. There's an attribution process that we go through, which actually in many ways holds ourselves to a higher degree of accountability and evidence-based than in other areas of attribution. I think at times, where do we fall flat? I think it's in showing the gravity of what a cyber incident has caused. And I think the better we can get as governments of explaining this and making it very clear to others exactly what the impacts have been, then it becomes a far easier case to make. If it's the deployment of a chemical weapon which kills someone, well, that's very visible, it's very, and rightly so, very immediately emotive, so it changes the mindset of those that are making that decision as to whether they attribute or not. Trying to convince someone that a specific cyber intrusion is of great enough significance at times is difficult, to be frank. Something I still scratch my head about is the fact that we're still having to convince some of the importance of the internet and everything that it enables. And when those elements of that structure fall down, the severity of that we should be better at making our case of the severity of that so that an attribution decision doesn't seem to be quite so difficult. So we hold ourselves to a high level of accountability. We have a technical aspect to attribution where we have the technical evidence in front of us, but that's always, if you like, co-located with all the different aspects of other information we have, the legal case, the political will to make these decisions, what we see in our own networks, if indeed it's come from another country, the suggestion that we should join an attribution. It's a multifaceted case that you put together and on that front.
So I think that's another thing folks can address is also the political will issue. I mean, for the Skripal poisoning, you had Salisbury poisoning, you had Theresa May able to first do attribution within like 5 days, then assemble a group of countries to impose costs within like a week and a half. For NotPetya, it was about 6.5 months until the attribution was done, and even then there was a promise of consequences, but they weren't really announced. So it's part of the general attribution question, if you want to address that part too.
Should I?
Yeah, go.
Yeah. So, first of all, I agree with what Toby said. I think we should realize that we are in uncharted waters here. So we have a couple of high-profile cases, but we, at the receiving end, are working our way through that to understand how we build the case, to understand what the relationship is between technical attribution and political attribution. So what constitutes evidence? What constitutes evidence for law enforcement agencies is not necessarily the same as what constitutes evidence for a diplomatic agency. And then we have to work our way through building the coalition. And I think we all agree that at the end of the day, attribution is a sovereign right, is a sovereign activity. And each nation that attributes or joins attribution makes its own decision based on the evidence they see. And sometimes it's difficult to see. In the case of the OPCW, it was very easy to see, thanks to the fact that it was done very openly and very clumsily. But they also base their decision on whether it's opportune in terms of the broader relationship with the nation that is allegedly the perpetrator. They base it on their own preference for signaling through back channels or doing it openly. So there's many reasons why nations have or have not joined. Having said that, I dare to predict that in the next OPCW case, so to speak, we will have an easier task of assembling a larger coalition. Because, like I said, we've only gone through 3 or 4 high-profile cases. Every time we go through such a case, it becomes a little bit easier to understand what the task is and how to build the coalition. And the tools that we have at our disposal, including the EU tools, make it a little bit more easy to get to that coalition. And one thing you mentioned is the time factor is very important. I think, especially also in the OPCW case, it took quite a while before we could actually come out with our conclusions and attributions.
Yeah, to indeed echo that and what Toby also said to begin with, it's really learning by doing. So, and that is not only the case for attributing and how you attribute and how you cooperate on a national and on an international level, but also when it comes to mainstreaming cyber into foreign policy. So you also need to connect communities that are maybe usually not really connected to each other, that don't have knowledge about each other's worlds, about each other's dynamics. And also when it comes to attribution, it's I don't think we need to see that as the holy grail. Attribution is a means to an end, but it's not the end game itself. It's not an objective in itself. And you can also respond to malicious cyber activity without actually attributing. So not all diplomatic measures would need a decision on attribution in order to be effective. And this is also part of this broader perspective on cyber diplomacy and how this diplomacy toolbox or how response fits within. So if you're looking at attribution, you're doing an act which is very direct and very immediate, while sometimes the idea of having multiple measures that you implement over time, increasing pressure, increasing your dialogue with the alleged perpetrator, but also building your international coalition in order to enforce this responsible behavior might in time be more effective than attributing at a certain point. So I think we also need to keep in mind what's our end game, and does attribution fit within this end game?
Yeah, Adam?
The only thing I wanted to add along the lines of the point already made is I'm very conscious of the fact that law enforcement tools are not the only means by which we should attribute malicious activity. However, if we are going to use a law enforcement tool, I think it's critical that everything we do uphold the credibility of that tool and be consistent with law enforcement principles generally. So that means that when we bring a case charging a state actor, we bring it only in the same way we would bring any criminal case, based on the same standards we'd apply, the same evidence collection measures. And that may mean that law enforcement is not always able to answer the call if the executive branch wants to attribute conduct, but I think that's the way it has to be, because the worst thing I think we could do is somehow lower the bar or change our standards and thereby politicize what must be an inherently apolitical decision.
Anyone else want to comment on that? Rob,
I just add that I think it's important to recognize between governments that we have multiple channels for sharing information and figuring out how best we can work with different governments. It's going to vary by country where the best way to share information. I also think that while it's inherently a sovereign decision to make an attribution or decide on consequences on how to move forward, the playing field's been shaped very much by cyber threat intelligence companies who are putting out basically their own attributions on a daily basis that influences the debate.
So is it fair to say that the panel was unanimous that if there was a move, say, in the UN or someone else to come up with a standard of attribution, a requirement like Justice has of some kind, that none of you think that's a good idea? No one disagrees? Okay, interesting. I agree too. The other issue with attribution is it's been great that we've done these public attributions, but these countries, North Korea and Russia, unlikely to be named and shamed, so you really get into the consequence issue. And as difficult as to build a coalition for attribution, I'd imagine it's even harder to then build a coalition to take action. And so Manon, let me start with you. You talked about the diplomatic toolkit. That's a great new thing that came out. I think it sends a really strong political message. But is it really reasonable to think you're going to get, and as I understand it, you need unanimity of 28 or maybe 27 in a few months to actually impose those sanctions? And does that make it more of a political threat than it actually is going to be a practical tool?
Well, my answer would be, why not? I mean, why wouldn't we be able to decide on this by 28? We have been imposing sanctions for a lot of malicious behavior before, so I don't see any reason why we wouldn't be able to impose sanctions or to list, because it's a very specific type of sanctions in response to malicious cyber activities. Yes, attribution might be harder, but as Toby said before, I think it's very important that we demystify the concept of attribution in cyberspace. It's possible to attribute, so I don't see any reason why we wouldn't be able to. Restrictive measures is an instrument that we always use to influence behavior, and which is part of a larger effort to work with a partner to make it stop its activities or make it alter its actions or its route. So in case of need, I'm convinced that we are able to impose those sanctions.
Toby, you want to say something?
Yeah, sure. I think there's a couple of things to add here. So as a government, we've done a kind of comprehensive sweep of everything we think we have at our disposal to respond to a specific cyber incident. And that stretches across every lever that we have. All the departments that you'd imagine come under that wing, wherever they might lie in government. And now it's a matter of understanding, well, how do we ensure that that's as usable and appropriate for a senior politician, policymaker to utilize in the most effective manner. And obviously a distinct part of that equation is how does it plug and play with our international partners? And I think also we've got to understand that that's never going to be a completely perfect fit. We can try as hard as we can, but it's not always going to be. And I think often when we think about joint responses, there might be, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there might be a perception by the public that immediately that's all countries doing the same thing and all going at the same time doing exactly the same action. And I often think of it on a quick XY axis, that you really have kind of lots of essentially two different lines running off it. One of which is, if you think of the x-axis as an increasing severity of response, and along the bottom, the time delineator, one line which is increasingly going up in terms of severity of response, and there might only be a few states that have the appetite or the capability to be able to respond in that way. And that's okay. And also you have more of a flat line response, which is those countries that don't have the capability to be, having the completeness of response toolkit at their disposal. Just that support and, diplomatic support is enough. So you can begin to see that you can plug and play in different ways. You don't all have to be doing the same thing. And actually it's more effective perhaps if you're all doing different things. And we're still all working through that as a community right now.
I mean, I think the challenge is even within governments, frankly. Manon, I did mean to put you on the spot, but the reason I did, in part, was even within the U.S. government, getting Treasury, Justice, and State to all agree on sanctions wasn't all that easy. So getting 27 or 28 member states would be hard, and that's true for any of these actions. Adam, I want to drill down on something you said, and I don't think you meant it this way. You said answer the call. So back, as I talked to you last night, back in 2007, when I was in the criminal division, I went to our leadership at that point and floated the idea of bringing a case against Chinese actors. But at that point, because there wasn't really a realistic possibility of getting those actors in the U.S. for trial, and it was seen as more of a signaling than anything else, the view was we don't do that. And you mentioned this in your opening comments. What do you think changed? You said there was a big change in 2012. What turned things around there? What changed that attitude? And I understand you do get some of them, so it's not like they're all out there. And then the second part of that question, and I have one follow-up, is you said this is one of the tools for deterrence, one of the tools for imposing costs. When you're indicting individuals, does that really have an effect, do you think, on the nation state and how they act?
Sure. Okay, you might have to remind me of the second question because I may forget it by the time I get to the end of the first answer. So the way I recall things in 2012 is there were two related choices. One was a decision across the federal government that IP theft in particular, for the economic benefit of Chinese companies specifically, was something we had to do more to confront, and that we were going to broaden the aperture of tools beyond merely diplomacy to do that. Separate and independent, but related to that, at the Justice Department, the National Security Division leadership at the time thought, with respect to national cyber security generally, not just China, we should have an enforcement program there in the same way we do with respect to export control and sanctions, economic espionage, traditional espionage, terrorism, right? Why should cyber be the one major national security threat vector that lawyers do nothing at all on? So that was a pretty obvious missing piece. And when we started building cases, I wasn't in the meeting in 2007. I don't want to cast aspersions on it, but it wasn't about should we bring a case or not. It was we should have an enforcement program for this threat vector the same way we do for every other national security threat vector. And the goal is not just or solely or even principally public attribution. It's disruption, right? We talk about counterterrorism efforts. We speak in terms of disruption. To our best efforts, we want to prevent a crime from occurring. We certainly want to hold folks accountable if they commit an act of violence. And we want to take steps to make it harder for an organization to plot that kind of activity. So borrowing from that, in cyber, yeah, we want to charge people and we want to apprehend them if we can. We also want to think more broadly about the ways we can use legal tools to seize infrastructure, to seize assets, to make it more difficult for them to engage in their activity. So I think one of the reasons we were more comfortable bringing the PLA case in 2014, that we didn't see it as mirror signaling, is that we build up an entire infrastructure across the country to treat cyber the same way we treat every other national security threat, and just put it on the table instead of taking law enforcement off the table. So that's, I think, what was different. And in terms of you're never going to get these guys, I mean, CSIPs has been targeting foreign hackers for years. They're often very hard targets.
That's the Computer Crime and Intellectual Property section.
Yeah, the criminal division where you were working at the time. Our counterterrorism section and prosecutors around the country have been bringing cases against terrorists abroad who may never be apprehended. But if you don't start building those cases now when an incident occurs, you're never going to have the option to arrest someone 3 years from now if they travel. And finally, these cases are not all public, right? I mean, some of them are when we make an operational choice that we're more likely to disrupt by being public than we are by waiting for an arrest if they travel. But there are really two separate decisions to make. One is whether to investigate and charge a case, and the other is whether to be public about the charges. And there are different factors, legitimate factors that play into that. I forgot your second question.
Well, it was whether it has, I think you kind of answered, whether it really has a deterrent effect on nation states. And what I want to pivot to is the follow-up question, which is, law enforcement tools, especially in the US, are unique among that toolkit to impose costs, because the Justice Department has a lot of independence on this. In fact, that's a tradition, long-standing tradition. When, for instance, the indictment of the Chinese actors happened, you could not persuade the Chinese government that it wasn't the White House that was directing it and can control it and could dismiss counts and do other things because justice really was independent. And there's good reasons for that. I mean, the two reasons obviously are you don't want the president or the White House either going after its enemies or forgiving its friends. But when you're charging nation-state actors, the calculus is a little different. Should this be more of an all-of-government effort, or do you think that the independence that justice has really needs to be preserved in this area?
Both. So here's how I think it should work. Across the national security portfolio, whether you're talking about terrorists or spies or other actors, our cases present potential national security and foreign policy consequences. And consequences for the intel community. So we're very used to having conversations about what the ramifications of cases will be and making independent decisions in light of what we hear. So here's how I think it works and should work. The first is we should prioritize resources in alignment with our national security strategy, right? So you don't want the Justice Department or law enforcement off somewhere over here pursuing cyber threats that are not, in fact, critically important. But that's a programmatic awareness. Second, it should be the Justice Department that chooses individual targets and charges and which cases to bring, right? So we are informed by, as I mentioned in 2012, the sense that IP theft from China or by China was a major issue. But it was the Justice Department that said, okay, among all of these potential cases, which are the cases that we can legitimately bring? And that was our decision, an independent decision. And the third stage is presenting an option, whether it's to the IC or the State Department, or indicating we intend to move forward, and then receiving feedback, whether it's about whether sources and methods will be exposed, whether there's concerns about reciprocity, whether the timing of a charge or an arrest causes diplomatic concern, or other policy concerns. And then those concerns are given to the Attorney General, and he or she makes a decision about whether to move forward in his discretion. So that is a way that you can have input into the Justice Department without compromising its independence or undermining the credibility of the tool.
Before we open up the audience, Rob, I had a couple of questions for you. One, You talked about the need for collective action, for building coalitions of countries, and that's part of the new deterrence initiative. At the same time, I've heard, I don't think it's in their published strategies, but several folks at DoD say deterrence is dead. Deterrence doesn't work. We need to do something else, and this has led to their persistent engagement, forward deployed sort of strategy. First of all, have we tried deterrence? Have we exhausted deterrence? Does deterrence not work, or is this something that we really need to do? And then I have a follow-up question that's a little harder, I think.
Yeah, I think it's important to think about the whole span of international relations or international conflict among different tools. Cyber is just emerging as a tool that states are using in the way it has. I mean, it was used by Russia in 2007 in Estonia, but it wasn't until 2012 that we saw these DDoS attacks against our banks by Iran, and then in 2014 we had Sony attacks. So it's only in the last few years that we've seen these attacks. So now we're responding with a national cyber strategy that has a deterrence element to it, and we've only roughly 7 months past that cyber deterrence strategy being noted in our national cyber strategy. So we're just getting going on actually bringing consequences. We've done the attribution, but we're going to need to bring more fulsome, costly, and transparent consequences to bear. And just to the point about DoD efforts, we're very transparent about our doctrine there, but I see these as fully complementary. This is focusing on the disruptive and destabilizing activities. There's a far broader range of activities that are malicious in cyberspace that are not encompassed by a deterrence strategy.
So that persistent engagement alone is not enough. We need to actually impose costs, either for past conduct or to warn about future conduct. The other part of the strategy, when they talk about defending forward, one of the statements was we're defending forward at as close to the adversary as possible. And I had a colleague from Finland say, "Does that mean in Finland?" So the question is, there are times when there are actions that happen in other countries, and does that defending forward strategy, that persistent engagement, which talks about persistent engagement all over the world, really. Does that complicate the effort to build alliances and to build coalitions to take other actions on cyber? Are they too complementary?
Well, I think it's important to note that any activities that we undertake by DoD are in conformance with the obligations that we've made, including the 12 norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. So we fully are in line with the commitments that we've made when it comes to all DoD activities. And I would just particularly note that, well, the concept of defending forward, what is forward in cyberspace? Cyberspace is obviously everywhere, it's domestic, it's around the world. So I also think it leads to a sort of limited understanding of, people basically read, i.e. offensive, but, really defending forward includes a number of activities that are actually, in some people's book, defensive, could be defending your own networks, could be taking other activities that are seen as defensive rather than just what some people, I think, perceive when they hear that word is an offensive cyber activity. So it's a full, broader spectrum of activities.
I'm going to open up for questions in just a minute, so if you have questions, start lining up the microphones. I just wanted to ask the panelists if they had anything else to say on either of those topics before we try to go to questions. If not, we'll have other questions I can talk about. I see one person over here.
I'm Yewan from Radio Free Asia, and I would like to turn the attention to North Korea. And my question is mostly for Mr. Hickey and Ambassador Strader, but it's also, of course, open to other panelists. Could you say a little bit more about how you assess the cyber attacks from North Korea and their malicious activities in cyberspace, and your specific strategies and response to their attacks against the United States?
I'll open that up to folks. It was, I think, basically, how do you respond to North Korea's cyber actions? You can't really name and shame them, maybe, but what else should we be doing? I think that's what I heard. The acoustics are not great here, but I think that's what I heard. And I'm also happy so many people are lined up for questions. Anyone want to?
Yeah, so, as part of the UN Security Council resolutions and our own policy in the United States, we were asking countries around the world to to end joint ventures with North Korean companies and to expel their IT workers. We know that those IT workers can be actors that participate in malicious cyber activity. It's no secret that North Korea is not well connected to the internet, so they can use platforms around the world to do these malicious activities. And then secondly, it's very important that we continue to work with countries around the world to improve their cyber defenses, to improve their capacity to defend themselves. We've seen a number of these banks attacked. So there's an importance to improving cyber defenses around the world.
Other microphone over here.
Chris Fenn, undergraduate student, American University. It seems evident that there's certain norms and standards established by the Western model of the internet and cyberspace that differ from those that are under the authoritarian model. So I wanted to know whether these two models are reconcilable and whether a common set of norms can prevail.
I'll throw that up in the panel. Basically, the conflict between more authoritarian regimes and Western democracies, not all West in the West. And so, how does that work with respect to norms? Can those two systems be reconciled, I think?
Clearly for you, Toby.
Thank you. I'll take that on.
Netherlands nominates Australia.
Thank you so much, Timo. So, look, we respect the fact that it's a sovereign decision to, every country has a right to interpret its own vision of how the internet works and operates within its own borders. But when it comes to norms at the international level, well, I've sounded like a broken record on panels like this, but I'll keep doing it. In 2015, we all agreed that there were set norms of behavior which were suggested by various countries around that table. We as a country in Australia, we've put that into policy. We've put it in our international cyber engagement strategy. We've, again, put our money where our mouth is on that front. And that's important because not all of those norms were suggested by countries we would agree with their vision of how the internet is run within their own borders. But it's part of a negotiation that sometimes you agree to things which perhaps don't always sit so easily with you as a nation. So at the international level, we would say we've already got those norms in place. It's now about the fact that certain countries who signed up to those norms don't seem so willing to actually keep to the letter of what they signed to. We see that as the issue. We have norms, and there's a couple of countries who would really like to see those norms unraveled and go back to the drawing board and start from scratch again. Because to be frank, I think there's a realization they've signed up to things that they're perhaps not quite so comfortable with now, but that's not, that's after the fact. We have an agreed set of norms. Go and look at the 2015 UNGGE reports or look at Australia's International Cyber Engagement Strategy. You'll see them there. Chris explained a few of them earlier on. And so as far as we're concerned, that's in play. Can the two systems exist side by side? I think it's one of the fundamental questions that challenges us all on this panel. And challenges government more so than at any other point in history. I think we are at a tipping point in, if you like, the way that the internet is run and governed. We have a vision of what that looks like, but there is no doubt it's being challenged, and we need to think long and hard about how we confront that and ensure that the values that we represent are not lost in what is shaping up right now.
Yeah, and I don't know if anyone else wants to comment. I would just add that there are some norms that do. There are some restrictions in states doing things within their own boundaries when they're matters of international human rights too. So you can't suppress all dissent, control everything completely. That is against that declaration. So there are some things on that score too. The other thing is countries have agreed to these norms because it's been in their interest to do so. And even during the Cold War, there were times when the US and Russia agreed on things because neither of them wanted things to escalate. So for instance, don't attack critical infrastructure. It was in the country's interest, including China and Russia, to agree to that. Now, do they hew to those norms? That's a different issue, and that gets into enforcement. We'll go over here.
Yeah, hi, I'm Terry Thompson from the Johns Hopkins University. My question is about international law enforcement cooperation, specifically related to the Council of Europe's Convention on Cybercrime, also known as the Budapest Convention. Soon to be 20 years old since it was initially signed, and well over 10 years since Australia, the US, the Netherlands, and 60 or so other countries have signed this treaty. My question is, was it helpful? Is it still working? Or has the Budapest Convention become outdated, obsolete, and should be abandoned?
I can answer that, but I'm going to let the panel answer.
Chris might need to fill in a few spots. I mean, from my perspective, it is working well for those who are parties to it. We rely increasingly in this area, among all others, on cooperation from other nations to preserve evidence, to share evidence. The sharing that the Netherlands did in connection with our indictment of the World Anti-Doping Agency and OPCW was unprecedented in a cyber case, really extraordinary. And so from the standpoint of those who are signatories, I feel pretty good about it. I mean, obviously things take time, but we've found mechanisms to preserve evidence and freeze it in place essentially while we work through various procedures to get it formalized for use in court. Not everyone is a signatory, obviously, and so I think the challenge is that we have a few nations, Russia and China specifically, that much less, not signatories, are refusing to assist in any respect with respect to sort of reining in criminal activity in cyberspace within their borders, whether or not they sponsor it. So I think there's more to be done, but I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah, I would just remark that that was something we all worked on. It was an important issue, and it's the only treaty that's out there. And more countries, and I think this is lost, have joined this every year. And so, Manon knows this, and Rob too, a lot of the diplomatic play on the cybercrime side is to try to get more countries to accede and join the Budapest Convention. There hasn't been any backing away from it.
No, there has been indeed a lot of states that have joined even recently in the process of joining the Budapest Convention. And that's because it sets a really good and clear framework for a legal instrument on cybercrime, and it really allows for international cooperation to take place. So this framework is something that we support and that we promote everywhere around the world, and that actually the EU has been spending a lot of capacity building funds over the last years to help also states to implement and to draft their legislation and to implement the legislation, to help law enforcement and judiciary to move forward with this instrument. So for us it's a very important instrument really to avoid impunity in cyberspace, and that allows for international cooperation to do so.
Great. We'll go to this mic, I guess.
Hi, I'm Teresa Hitchens with the online magazine Breaking Defense. Hi, Chris. Nice to see you again. I have a question about what seems to me to be a fundamental disconnect between a strategy where a small number of nations get together to impose consequences, perhaps including offensive military consequences, upon folks who they see as breaking norms. Whereas norm setting is usually a voluntary cooperative measure. And so we've got a certain number of norms out of the 2015 GGE. They are voluntary. So I don't see how you can continue to try to engage nations who are not like-minded in norm setting when you're also developing a strategy that says, but we're going to punish you when we decide you violated the norms.
I'll start with Timo.
Yeah, I think you have a good point, and at least in my presentation, I try to convey that our, let's say, sanctions or attribution or naming and shaming is not the only tool in the toolbox. So we have what I would call a response continuum that starts with our own resilience and then builds through capacity building and reaching out to those nations who may have signed on to the norms in 2015 but are not so much adhering by it. And there's different ways of making them, let's say, stick to those norms. And the ultimate response would be indeed to name and shame, to attribute, to try to deter. But that's not our preferred response. So on the one hand, as Toby already said, we have a collective of nations around the world that have agreed to the norms in 2015. On the other hand, if you permit me a sort of a philosophical remark, in the West, and I would include Australia in that, we sometimes too easily assume that universal values and rights are universal. We have to keep working at that. We have to keep working at explaining to our adversaries what those norms are and what it means to subscribe to them, which they have done, but also the large number of states that are sort of in between us and those adversaries. there are, I think, a lot of nations that don't fully, let's say, understand when and how they would violate a norm. So there's actually a task for us to help them understand what is required and what it means to subscribe to a norm.
Indeed, I fully agree with Timo. If you look at the EU framework, it's an EU framework to respond to malicious cyber activities, and that does not necessarily mean that we're going to impose costs to states who breach those norms. That can also mean that we see that, for instance, there's a need for capacity building on the Budapest Convention to help states counter cyber crime. So it's not only about attributing and about imposing costs and imposing sanctions. This is a way broader spectrum that we put forward to respond to malicious cyber activities, which also include, indeed, talks about normative behavior and what that is, doing outreach, doing capacity building, investing in confidence building measures on a regional level. So it's way broader than only this part that talks about cost imposition and really is the escalatory part of it. I think the focus should be on this wider effort of conflict prevention and of encouraging cooperation and ensuring that cyberspace is stable and secure for us all to benefit from cyberspace and the internet in particular. So I fully agree with what Timo said on this.
Could I just ask that Mr. Strayer address this, because you talked very strongly about offensive measures?
Well, I think I spoke strongly about consequences, not just offensive measures. I think it's beyond debate that the times that we've worked together with the international community to bring to these attributions, there was a violation of the norms, in particular the norm against disrupting or damaging critical infrastructure. Both NotPetya and WannaCry disrupted critical infrastructure, caused billions of dollars of damage, and caused massive disruptions around the globe. So those are times we work together to impose those to do the attribution, and we impose consequences. I don't disagree with my colleagues that there's education efforts that we should conduct around the world, but we shouldn't sort of rest on our laurels that we know the norms and someone's violated it. We need to make it clear that we are going to take action.
All right, we're running short on time, so we're going to do a lightning round now. We'll just ask each of the people in line to ask a short, succinct question, and then we'll have the panel choose among those questions and answer them or try to answer all of them. So we'll start over here, short and quick.
Peter Scharfman, MITRE Corporation. This morning we heard David Coe suggest that conversation should begin in areas of agreement and only work gradually towards areas of disagreement. How do you feel about that?
Okay, over here.
At the risk of being pelted with tomatoes, so someone said, whether other countries decide to join in a joint or make a joint attribution is sometimes dependent on whether they want like 100% certainty. My question is, what is the percentage of certainty that the U.S. uses in making our attributions? And maybe for that question, it might be necessary to clarify or help us understand this distinction between technical and political attribution. And are the indictments that the U.S. made against certain Chinese officials, for example, are those considered political or nation-state attribution, or is it just for those individuals?
Okay, got it. This mic? Go ahead, yeah, sorry.
Well, I don't know if I'm the only one from Gang of Four, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. So I would ask a little bit longer, 3 comments and questions. First, do we have an acceptable, mature international norm on cyberspace? Yes, we are working on that, but I heard this morning there are different versions. And go further on enforcement. Who will do the enforcement? The panel members are from all NATO or Five Eyes. All of you? Or I do suggest that maybe you should put a Russian member in the panelists? That's my first question and comment. Secondly,
I'm sorry, we are running out of time, so can I ask?
I do
make
smell
one more.
a Cold War dangerous. So my question is, shall we go back to Cold War environment? If that served all of your interests or the whole world interest? Thirdly, I don't think we should be overconfident about the cyber attribution. For me, cyber attribution is closely connected to intelligence. So you may say that's also something about espionage. Actually, we know that up to date, JFK assassination is still an unanswered question. And we are human beings. We are easily to make mistakes. So today, in cyberspace, there are so many entities. I do concern about the someday future, maybe big countries be pulled into a war by a third party. So if there's too much overconfidence, that's really dangerous.
Thank you. I think if you have like a one-line question, I'll let you ask it, but then we're running out of time. We'll have to get the panelists. So.
Thank you, Charles Yarpo, JCHU. I was going to ask about use of commercial technology in cyber attacks, and what do you do about that when one country uses another country's hardware to launch an attack?
Okay. I'm going to go down the panel. You can take any of those questions. We don't have much time, so snappy answers. Toby, what do you want to say?
Okay.
And people can come up and talk to us at lunch or afterwards, too.
David's always right. How can I disagree with David? But I might. We do have to work on the areas that we disagree as well, but let's reaffirm all the things we agree on first and show all the good work that we've done, make sure we don't lose that, and then move forward to the areas of disagreement, of which there's many. Joint attributions, 100% certainty. I'm not going to answer on the USA's behalf. It's variable. You're looking for a beyond reasonable doubt case, okay? And how can you bang a percentage on that? Perhaps Adam can give a better answer than I on that. Look, on the question of norms, we do have those norms. And again, I'll keep repeating myself, 2015, China was as much a signatory as any other nation around that table to the 11 norms of state behavior that would agree to there. So we already have that. Full stop. Done.
Adam, got 30 seconds.
So indictments are not political. I don't know what people mean by political attribution, but what I mean when I bring an indictment is that, or grand jury returns it, that we have proof that we can bring to court beyond a reasonable doubt that particular individuals committed violations of U.S. federal law. Indictments are not against nations, they are against individuals, and we welcome the opportunity to show our proof in court if any of those defendants choose to appear there.
Timo.
Yeah, the reference by the Chinese gentleman to the Cold War, I think every effort is spared at this moment, not just by people from behind this table, to prevent a Cold War kind of atmosphere. We do not want to go back into a situation where we have spheres of influence where nations, and especially third nations, have to choose whether they join one camp or the other. The whole idea of the UN processes, the whole idea of agreeing norms in UN framework is actually to bring the world together. And I don't think it's actually fair to say that there's a Cold War atmosphere about it. Your comment that we could end up in a conflict triggered by a third party is I don't know whether that's realistic or not, but it does actually signal that states should be very, very careful in hiring proxies to carry out cyber attacks. So if that's a practice, then you do raise the unpredictability of the situation, and that's certainly not what we would want.
Manon.
Indeed, I would say that the cyber diplomacy toolbox is there to encourage cooperation and to mitigate cyber threats and to influence behavior. And it's not there to escalate or any of that kind. I think we all are a supporter of the rules-based order, and we would all like security and stability in cyberspace. And enforcement is a part of that effort to make sure cyberspace remains open, free, stable, and secure. It belongs in the full package of cyber diplomacy efforts. And in that sense, I don't think we should talk about escalation or conflict. We should work to try to avoid it, and that's what we've been doing in the UN context for the last year.
Rob.
For those that are concerned about the potential for escalatory activity in cyberspace related to nation states, I think they should follow our model and the model of many other democracies, and that is to announce what your policies are. I invite China and Russia to do that. We've published a Department of Defense cyber strategy. We've been very transparent about our activities in cyberspace. Others should do the same. And on that line of transparency, I'd point out that the DOJ indictments that they put out there have been basically not responded to by the nations of the citizens of those nations that were indicted. So we've been very exacting and long indictments that detail numerous facts that have been undisputed.
So I want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you for all the folks in the audience who asked questions. I just say two things. One, as part of this, I don't think the goal here is stability. The goal is not to create more instability. So dialogue is also important, even with the countries you don't agree with. And second, I think someone pointed out that I was pushing a lot of the panelists on the difficulties of sharing information and making attribution. But I'd say this. I think we are making strides. I think this is a process. It's going to take time to get that information sharing down, those countries to act. But I do think it's critical that we continue to work in this space, impose consequences when we must, but also work with other countries to have the stability. And I really thank everyone here today for their comments.